Do you have any favorite proverbs or aphorisms? You know, those short little sayings that your grandma or grandpa used to say that now you say, that reflect some of the wisdom that they'd picked up that gave them kind of a skill for living life well. You know, like actions speak louder than words, or we make choices and those choices turn around and make us. Yeah, just short statements of a general truth expressed in a concise and pithy and often witty and memorable way. Well, in the Bible, there's actually quite a bit of that kind of thing. It's a type of literature called wisdom literature. In this episode of the Discover the Word podcast, Rasul Berry is going to lead Elisa Morgan and Daniel Ryan Day and Vivian Mabuni in some conversations about the proverbial wisdom in the Old Testament book of Proverbs. Now, what proverbs are, what proverbs aren't, and how they can help us develop a skill for living life well is what we're going to explore together this time on the Discover the Word podcast. And welcome to Discover the Word, a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries. Our Daily Bread Ministries is a donor-supported nonprofit ministry dedicated to making the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible come alive for people all around the world. And this radio show, podcast, is one of the ways that we're hoping to fuel a worldwide Bible engagement movement. And so the section of Scripture that we'll be engaging together over the next hour or so is the Old Testament book of Proverbs, and its collection of these concise and pithy and memorable sayings that are not just good advice, but also provide a spiritual dimension that is the foundation for a truly skillful way of handling life. And so let's pull our chairs up to the table with Elisa and Daniel and Vivian and Rasul as he leads us in looking at some of this proverbial wisdom we find in the pages of the Bible.
Okay, so I want you to think about you growing up as a kid. What's some good advice that you remember getting from an adult?
Listen to your mom.
For me, it was just like pick up after yourself, and work before play. The pick up after yourself was helpful because even though I didn't like to do it, I noticed I tended to lose things less when I did pick up after myself.
Still learning that, aren't you?
I am still learning that. Thank you for bringing that up.
It's a timeless truth. There you go.
Well, part of the reason I'm asking, I'm excited to get into this series based on a book in the Bible that doesn't get a lot of attention, and that's the book of Proverbs. But let me just kind of start with that question. I mean, in your experience, how much attention have you seen the book of Proverbs get in the church and in Christian circles?
Well, actually, kind of a lot. There was one season of my life where I was instructed to read one chapter a day because there's, 31.
Okay.
I feel like Proverbs, often we end up with a proverb on a coffee mug. So we reference them. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. Or even mistakenly take a proverb as a promise, like if you raise your child in the ways of the Lord, then he'll never depart from it.
Right.
Like as if it's a promise.
Yeah, growing up in a home where business and entrepreneurship were big values and a lot of what my family was about, I feel like Proverbs showed up quite a bit because it's pretty practical in some ways. But I think personally, I've been much more drawn over the last few years, which you all know, to Ecclesiastes, which is like the other side of wisdom, which is when all the things in Proverbs that are supposed to work aren't working.
Right. Yeah, I think in my experience, when I think about the total amount of church services or conferences I've gone to, and I've not really heard theological framing around practical insight and even the relationship with those two things often is sometimes seen as, that's not even really spiritual enough for us. So you might get a lot of the Gospels, you might get a lot of the letters of Paul or something like that. But I think in the ancient Near East, wisdom was a sign that God was with someone. And even when we see Solomon, right, when he is anointed king, and God asks him, what is it that you want? And he asks for wisdom. And God was very pleased with that answer. And then he has this epic moment. Do y'all remember, when does it show up that, okay, Solomon is God's chosen successor to David? Like, what's kind of the evidence or the anecdote that they give?
That story of the two women, and they both had babies, and one baby died in the night.
Right.
And so one of the moms took the other baby, and then they bring it before Solomon. Like, they both are claiming this baby, and Solomon says, take out a knife. I'm going to cut the baby in half. You can each have half.
It's the weirdest story.
I know, but it's brilliant because
It is brilliant.
it's like
It's wise.
It's wise because the mom, who is truly the mom of the baby, was like, no, just give her the baby. I don't want the baby to die. Whereas the mom,
The imposter mom.
was satisfied with doing.
Right. And this is in 1 Kings chapter 3. And then at the end, after the real mother is discovered, it says, and all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice.
Isn't that cool? Wow.
Yeah. It wasn't just this kind of one-off, oh, that's interesting. And it's because, especially in the ancient Near East, they had this connection. They reasoned, if God created the world, then it would make sense that God has something to say about how to best live and thrive in the world that he made. And wisdom literature explores, that with one important caveat. And we've already talked about it. You mentioned we have to understand wisdom literature rightly because it's sometimes been misused or misapplied. First principle here that you mentioned, wisdom literature offers principles, not promises. Right. And you brought up the exact one I was thinking about in Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way that they should go. When they're old, they will not depart from it. This is not a promise that every child who grows up in a Christian home will never depart from their parents' faith. It's presenting a principle that the instruction and discipline that we offer children actually does shape them. And it shapes them typically in a way that moves them in the direction of being formed, right? But it can't be a promise because otherwise there would be no choice. What are some other, I don't know if there's some other like caveats that you have about how we engage Proverbs, kind of things that you want to make sure we don't do?
Yeah, well, I think that's why reading it with a book like Ecclesiastes can be so helpful because Ecclesiastes reminds us of the times that the Proverbs didn't work in the way that we expected.
Yeah.
Right? So Proverbs emphasizes, the counsel of wisdom by having other people speak into it, the importance of knowledge, those types of things. And then Ecclesiastes would be like, people that increase their knowledge, they increase their vexation. This is the word that it uses, right? Makes life worse for them.
It does.
Or Proverbs emphasizes often, hey, if you do the right things, typically good things happen to you. And Ecclesiastes is like, oh yeah? I've seen people that do all the right things and only bad things happen to them, and people who do all evil and only good things happen to them.
Yes.
So I think having another book like Ecclesiastes is helpful.
And I would say you also get shadows and snapshots of that in Proverbs as well when you talk about the wicked and how they oppress the poor and things like that. One quick note that I wanted to bring up is beware of concretism. Concretism is the tendency we can have of using a concrete example or seeing a concrete example and taking it too literally, right? So, for example, in Proverbs 6, even though it's addressing sons avoiding an adulteress, it doesn't mean that it's not also warning daughters not to avoid an adulterer as well, right? So that's an example. Or in Proverbs 21, and when it's talking about the annoyances of a nagging wife, it could just as easily be talking about the annoyances of a nagging husband or disharmony in relationships. So I think those are good backdrops. Okay, so now let's just kind of look at the first few verses of Proverbs 1-7 and kind of just get this thing kicked off with understanding the nature of wisdom. Vivian, can you read, those first 4 and then you read 5, 6, and 7?
Yeah. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity.
To give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction.
Okay, so who does this chapter, or Proverbs 1, attribute this proverb to?
Solomon.
Solomon, right? Yes. Now it is important to note that in Proverbs, they're also attributed to other people. So, for example, the oracles of Agar in 30, Lemuel, which is Proverbs 31,
Yes.
and the wise in general. But there is this sense, and we see in 1 Kings 4 that it does mention Solomon's interest in Proverbs and that he gathered thousands of them. Now, do you see anything? I know I talked earlier about sometimes how we see practical is very different than spiritual. Just in these first few verses, do you see spiritual implications to the practicalness of the wisdom? And if so, where?
Well, it ramps up to verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. So the preceding verses are explaining what wisdom is and what it looks like and how you're going to find it, but it really is connected to God.
And let's talk about when we say fear of the Lord, what does that mean?
I think respect, understanding, honoring him in his rightful place, which is as our King God, the ultimate authority. And provider and provision of wisdom.
Yeah.
And reverence.
And there is like a healthy fear of God is so big and powerful and in control and mighty and all that. So there's a root in it of God being so much bigger and the fear that comes from that. It's just good that we have a good and loving and kind Father who, even when our fear goes from that all respect, trusting God, to being actually afraid of God, God kind of brings us back to, no, I'm not that kind of God. I'm going to protect you and care for you.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of like you should have a healthy reverence of cliffs, right? Because of how gravity works. Like I should respect that. And in the same way that this reverence and humility before the creator of life and the world, the judge of morality and goodness, the Redeemer who makes the things right in the world and the conditions for flourishing happen, it makes sense for wisdom to begin with the understanding and a reverence of that God. And that is actually the right posture from which we can actually live life the way he intended.
We're talking about some of the proverbial wisdom found specifically in the Old Testament book of Proverbs. Wisdom that is more than just good advice because its foundation is that fear of the Lord. There's a spiritual dimension to it as well. It's actually God's invitation to learn wisdom from previous generations about how to live a life in a way that honors God and also honors our relationships with others. Well, next, Rasul leads off this part of the conversation by saying,
in this conversation, we're going to focus on a topic that Proverbs talks about more than any other book in the Bible, and that is pride.
Yeah, so let's focus on some proverbial wisdom about this topic that Proverbs talks about more than any other book in the Bible, and the devastating consequences that unchecked pride can unleash on our lives.
So let's start with this question. When you think of the word pride, right, what comes to mind and what does it mean?
I always think of C.S. Lewis says it's the most challenging sin because it just separates us. You know, we put ourselves in the place of God, which is kind of the ultimate error, isn't it?
Yeah.
It seems like pride in the negative sense is kind of this root of sin.
Right.
But there's also a positive pride too. Like we can be proud of our heritage. We can be proud of our sports team.
Proud of our kid.
Yeah. So there's a healthy pride too. But I think the pride that Proverbs is warning of is the negative one.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that can sometimes get confusing when we use the word pride, and Vivian, you hit on this, is because there's two different definitions that are very prominent. And I would actually say the one that is more prominent now is not the one that the Bible is mostly talking about. So in the dictionary, you might see reasonable self-esteem. So a carpenter taking pride in her
work.
craft, right? Somebody who's just has a sense of, self-esteem.
Right. And so many times, especially in the Christian world, we dismiss that. But that's not honoring the image of what God's made us to be. And so when you don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but don't think of yourself more lowly than you ought. Have an accurate, sane understanding of who you are.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that type of pride is not what we're talking about in Proverbs.
Okay.
It's what you were saying is the quality of having an excessively high opinion of oneself and one's self-importance.
That gets into entitlement.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Pride, when you add the words haughty or arrogant, which are related in Proverbs, it shows up 15 times in the book of Proverbs in 31 chapters. And so it's a big deal. So let's just read some of the verses. Elisa, if you could take Proverbs 8:13, Vivian, Proverbs 11:2, Daniel 21:24.
Sure.
And then we'll just kind of read some of those and reflect on it.
Okay, Proverbs 8:13. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance and the way of evil and perverted speech I hate.
Proverbs 11:2 reads, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom.
In Proverbs 21:24, scoffer is the name of the arrogant, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride.
Okay, and then Proverbs 16:5. Everyone who is arrogant in heart is an abomination to the Lord.
Yeesh.
Be assured he will not go unpunished. And can you take Proverbs 16:18? Yep.
Yeah, 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall.
Okay, and again, once again, in light of the conversation around Proverbs, which typically centers on practicalness, where do you see spiritual issues surface in these verses?
Well, I think there's a general sense in which, especially in Proverbs, the type of pride that's being described is losing track of who God is and who I am.
That's a good way to put it.
Right? And so it's any time that we start trying to take the place of God, any time that we lose track of the fact that God is almighty and powerful and the one in control, like I know better than God, so I'm going to do it my way. So I think that's part of what I see even in these verses is there's two ways to go through the world. I know what's right and best, or God knows what's right and best. And the haughty, the proud, the arrogant tend to think, I know what's best instead of God.
I think of that old but still very applicable illustration from what used to be Campus Crusade, is now Cru, of who sits on the throne of your life, who is there. And when we get up on the chair of the throne and shove God off and start governing, that would be a version of pride.
Yeah, pride is a deeply spiritual problem and sin with very practical consequences. Isaiah 14, when it talks about, or even Jesus, when he says, I saw Lucifer fall, from heaven, there's a sense in which in Isaiah 14, literally part of what is declared in verse 14 says, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Right. And that's the sense of losing that sense of orientation of who God is. And we see that in the fall, the very first sin. You know, if you eat of this, you will be like God. And
then the Tower of Babel.
Yes.
Let's make a name for ourselves and build a tower to the heavens.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, we all know of loved ones who didn't deal with their pride, and now they won't listen when there's health concerns that need to be handled or destructive patterns in people's lives. But the tricky thing is sometimes it's hard for us to see in ourselves. And I'm so glad that you mentioned C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity, because when I read that book, that chapter on pride, I remember there's this moment where he's going in, he talks about how it leads to every other vice. It is an anti-God state of mind. He's talking about how irritating arrogance can be. And I was like, yeah, C.S. Lewis, get him. And then he says, if you want to find out how proud you are, the easiest way is to ask yourself, how much do I dislike it when other people snub me or refuse to take notice of me or patronize me or show off? The point is that each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. I literally put the book down and was like,
get out of my head.
It's the you spot it, you got it.
Yeah.
And so have you noticed even in your own lives that sometimes it's tough to identify when you might be struggling with pride? Like, I'll out myself. I remember there was when I was in college,
I got my holy
we were
oil
doing a group project. And part of the group project, we had queued up, or at least we were supposed to queue up a video, show the video, and then we were all going to like take turns leading the group in insights about the video, me and the others on my team. Well, something happened. This was back when we had VHS. So I'm dating myself.
Yeah.
But so it wasn't as easy to get to the right timestamp, and we couldn't find it. And so I decided, you know what? I'm good on my feet. I'll just use a different clip and just kind of riff on that, and everybody will be able to follow along. Well, they were not able to follow along, and they were really upset. Like, why did you do that? And it was because I had an overconfidence in my ability to just, I just can kind of make it work.
Would you call that pride?
Yeah, a little bit.
I've noticed in me, probably where it shows up the most is I am very confident that I remember the right order of events in the past.
Especially with your wife.
Yeah, like it could be with Rebecca or with others. And sometimes I find out that I didn't.
Mm-hmm. It's really connected to judging others too, isn't it? You know, because I think I'm right. You know, and everything I do, I'm doing it the right way because I care about doing things the right way. You know, I think the way I put together an outfit, or the way I go through the grocery store, or the way I'm driving, it's all great. And anybody who does it differently, well, they're just dumb. You know, and that's just pride.
Right. And I think there we see the gap between when self-esteem and self-confidence pours into an over-exaggerated sense
puffed
of
up.
one's.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing is we don't just see pride talked about, but we also see its antidote, humility. In Proverbs 11:2, when it says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with the humble is wisdom. And we see the importance of wisdom. 1 Peter 5:5 says, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
I really love just a few other verses that, you know, that humble yourselves, therefore, before the almighty hand of God. And in due time, he will exalt you as it pleases him. And his exalting doesn't necessarily look like, you know, I'm going to be all that, but just trusting him to work things out equitably the way he sees it in the end.
And humility is another word that sometimes gets misunderstood and misapplied in Christian contexts. We think it's that worm theology perspective of just dumping criticism and heaping unimportance on yourself. And that is not what humility is talking about. I love the way that the late Tim Keller put it in The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. He said, the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less. And this idea of not centering you as the main plot point of the entire universe, right? But putting God in that place and then looking to see how can I serve others and not just be served. That it is the service that is the antidote to pride and is the reminder to ourselves that we're not here to be the most important person in every room, but we're here to see others as more important than ourselves.
Proverbial wisdom on the topic of pride, because pride is a deeply spiritual issue at its core, with very practical and real consequences. But by becoming more and more like Jesus, we can learn to walk in humility. And humility and serving others can be, as Rasul said, the antidote to the selfish, destructive kind of pride that the Proverbs warn against. Well, next we'll discover the two competing ideas that form the moral logic of the book of Proverbs. In each of our lives, there is a competition going on between wisdom and folly. And so which is in the lead in your life right now? Which is winning that competition, wisdom or folly? Well, an important piece of our study of proverbial wisdom is ahead of us after we take a time out for a word from Our Daily Bread Ministries. Now, Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and we are on a mission to connect people with the Bible and the good news about Jesus all around the world. Our strategy to do that includes a lot of different efforts like this radio show and podcast. And this week, I want to tell you also about another important way we're doing that here in the United States. You may not know that we have a prison ministry which serves roughly half of the prisons in our country. Some of the ways we're reaching out to inmates is by providing our printed daily devotional, Our Daily Bread. We also provide online content and a leadership program. Now, Bo Cornelius is our new director of prison ministries, and he understands firsthand the hopelessness that can come with a prison sentence. He has said, understanding hopelessness behind bars really redefined that word for me and made me understand how important hope is. And so let me take just a moment to tell you more about our prison ministry and how you can get involved. A chaplain from Hawaii recently wrote to tell us your devotional, Our Daily Bread, is the most popular and sought-after resource by our brothers here at the Halawa Correctional Facility. Our Daily Bread is a great resource to reach out to the broken and lost souls here, some of which may never actually come to chapel, but request to have a devotional pamphlet. And then I also want to bring you up to speed on the monthly content that we provide for the God Behind Bars Pando app. In your app store, search for Pando app, and you'll see this first Christian app available behind bars. This app offers Christian, faith-based content for prisoners and their families. And Our Daily Bread Ministries content was viewed more than 1 million times and reached more than 30,000 subscribers in its first 6 months on the app. One of the most viewed was a video series that Rasul was part of called The Whole Man. As prisoners engage with this biblical content, we've seen more than 3,000 professions of faith. And that's pretty exciting to see how God is using this avenue and this content from Our Daily Bread Ministries to reach prisoners with the life-changing message of the gospel. And it's on this Pando app. So that's just a little bit about our prison ministry here at Our Daily Bread Ministries. We invite you to consider partnering with us, bringing hope and healing to people who so desperately need it behind bars. You can learn more about supporting us financially at discovertheword.org. Go to discovertheword.org and click the Donate button that's up at the top of the page. Well, we make choices, and those choices turn around and make us. That's something a wise friend told me years ago, and I've never forgotten it. We make choices, and those choices then turn around and make us. Well, in the next part of our conversation about proverbial wisdom in the book of Proverbs, we're going to discover that this is a main message. It's actually the moral logic of the Old Testament book of Proverbs. Now, in chapters 1 through 9, we find a series of speeches from a father to a son that outline this moral logic of the book of Proverbs, that choosing wisdom and the fear of the Lord leads to virtue and integrity and the kind of life that God intends. Choosing folly leads to selfishness and pride and eventually ruin and shame. We make choices, and those choices turn around and make us. And so let's talk about this wisdom versus folly choice and where it leads.
Okay, so what was a proverb, true or untrue? And I'm not just talking like biblical ones, just
sticks
in
and
life.
stones will break my bones, but words will never harm me.
True or untrue?
Totally false.
Right. Any other proverbs you remember hearing growing up?
Step on a crack, break your mother's back.
And you're just like,
avoid all the cracks.
Oh man, penny saved is a penny earned, or an apple a day keeps the doctor away.
Yep. What about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger? It's like, but as we've been journeying through the book of Proverbs, just thought it'd be helpful to just define quickly what is a proverb, because it's a type of statement literature that doesn't just exist in the scriptures. Proverbs are pithy, small, memorable statements, aphorisms, another word for them, that are principles to live by, right? But we just saw that with some untrue proverbs, like sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt you. It's possible to learn the opposite of wisdom.
Yeah,
too.
that's right.
And so Proverbs pictures a competition, the book of Proverbs, in our hearts and minds when it comes to wisdom and its opposite, folly. So we're going to look at this competition.
Would you define folly?
Yes. Folly has both a practical and a spiritual dimension to it. Like there are things that when we think of folly in our lexicon, if you ever use that word, we don't use it that much anymore. We're talking about just something that's an error, a mistake, untrue. Right? But in the book of Proverbs, there's this connection because remember, wisdom is being in sync with the creator of the universe and principles that govern the world that God made. And so folly also has a spiritual dimension of being in opposition to that wisdom, right?
It's almost like unwiseness.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, like a way of going about life that leads to bad decisions and leads to us choosing the wrong way and those types of things. So it's like a deeper reality of going through life looking for all the wrong things.
And it's more than naivete or ignorance.
Yep.
There's a little bit more intentionality that way.
Right.
Okay. Of unwiseness.
Yeah. So this is an aspect of sin
Okay.
that the Bible is talking about.
Thank you. That's helpful.
But not just looking at it from a vertical standpoint of just right and wrong. There is that component, but also looking at it from a horizontal, how we live on earth, that is not wise or that is not functional or that is not appropriate. And I think as we look at these passages in this section, we'll kind of start to see some of those dynamics when we see how both wisdom and folly are actually kind of personified. So Daniel, could you read Proverbs chapter 1, verse 20 through 23, and then we'll kind of reflect on some things there.
Wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the markets, she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you.
Okay, so what do you notice here about wisdom?
It kind of woos you. It's seeking you.
Crying out like everywhere.
Yeah. There's this active process because sometimes we think of education or knowledge as something that's seen as private or secretive or like, oh, I got it. No, like wisdom is like, come listen. I want to give out this sense of wisdom to everybody.
It's invitational to and an invitational from doing things this way to a new way or a better way.
Yeah. In fact, in verse 22, it invites those who are simple or, maybe unintelligent or scoffers to actually learn. It says, how long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing? A scoffer was someone who would just ridicule. We would call them trolls, today, right? And fools hate knowledge. It says, hey, if you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour my spirit, interesting, again, talking about the spiritual dynamics of wisdom, to you, I will make my words known to you. So even those who are astray, there's an invitation to come in, right? But wisdom, she's not the only component that's crying out. Let's go to Proverbs 9, 13 to 18. Elisa, if you could read that.
You bet. The woman folly is loud. She is seductive and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house. She takes a seat on the highest places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their way. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks sense, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol.
Ooh.
It's really interesting seeing those two next to each other because you have wisdom crying aloud in the street. You have folly crying aloud in the street, right? You have wisdom saying, don't be simple. Think through this. Here's a better way. And then folly, hey, who are simple, keep being simple.
Also, there's this aspect that folly is seductive. So there's this component where it doesn't say wisdom is seductive. It says that wisdom is personified as, this person who's saying, hey, learn from me. I will make life good for you. Right. And then in verse 17, of chapter 9, it gives a glimpse or a clip of how folly can be seductive. Where do you see there?
It says stolen water is sweet, bread eaten in secret is pleasant. It's just the hidden darkness part that makes it seem like it's enticing, or it's actually, to me, passive, because there's a sense that in order to gain wisdom, there's a learning. But if you just coast, it's just easy to fall into.
That's interesting.
You know, I think the inactivity can lead you into a path that's destruction.
Yeah, and there's also a play there between wisdom and folly too, because in verse 5 of chapter 9, wisdom says, "Come eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed." And then you have folly saying, "Come and eat this secret bread that I have."
Exactly. And there is something to, like, I think about heist movies where you look at them and you go, man, these people are so brilliant and talented and committed and hardworking.
Clever.
Why wouldn't they just use all of this ingenuity they have to actually build something of value in the world? And it's because at some points they'll actually say stolen water is sweeter, right? There's something about the thrill of doing it illicitly and deceiving people. And of course, usually, and this is what I kind of like about a lot of heist movies, it all comes crashing down. But there is something significant about seeing that folly is mentioned more in Proverbs than all the other books in the Bible combined. Folly, in the biblical sense of the word, is the act of rejecting or ignoring God's wisdom. And it can be defined as choosing to make one's own path and disregarding the pursuit of truth. Versus, we mentioned earlier in another conversation, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight.
That's right.
Well, folly says, no, I'm going to make my own path.
Yeah.
Well, the good thing is that before folly speaks in Proverbs 9, we actually hear and see wisdom act. And I think that will be a great way to kind of show where this contrast is. Vivian, can you read Proverbs 9, 1 through 6, and then 10 through 12?
Sure. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live, and walk in the way of insight. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. For by me your days will be multiplied, and years will be added to your life.
Interesting things happening here. One is that both in Proverbs 1, when wisdom calls out, you see a subtle difference between her approach and folly. One of them is she's actively walking. It mentions that folly is sitting near the house. And then here you see wisdom has built the house, hewn her pillars, slaughtered beasts, mixed wine, set the table. Like, you see this activity of doing things that is proactive, that is anticipatory of what is to come, and that really puts the onus on themselves. And that's the heart of wisdom. But at the end of the day, it's not just about our acts or our works. And that's where we get back to verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is insight. For by me your days will be multiplied and your years be added to your life. And again, principle, not promise. But the fact that wisdom is skilled makes her approach work. She builds and contributes to herself and others. Folly doesn't. Folly just takes. It's lazy and selfish. Wisdom and folly are calling out to us. And in our next conversation, we'll talk more about how to discern who is doing the calling.
Yeah, because there is a competition going on between wisdom and folly. And so who are you listening to? Because we make choices, and those choices turn around and make us. Well, we're talking about the proverbial wisdom of the book of Proverbs in this edition of the Discover the Word podcast. Rasul Berry is leading Elisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, and Vivian Mabuni on this overview of this collection of wisdom that can enable us to develop a skill for handling life in the way that God intends for us to live. Well, next, we're going to talk about another aspect of this proverbial wisdom in the book of Proverbs that comes up again and again, and it has to do with wise counsel. An important aspect of living life with skill is accessing and then actually listening to wise counsel.
I'm going to to ask you guys a question. When has been a time in your life when listening to counsel or not listening to counsel made a significant impact in your life?
Well, I can think of when my husband and I were pregnant with our first child, and we were in West LA trying to find a place to live. And we had a really tight budget, and so we were looking and looking. We could not find a place. And then we finally found this apartment. It really, we had prayed very specifically for certain things, and it met so many of the criteria, but it was outside our budget. It just seemed so unaffordable. And my mom happened to be in town, and we were eating lunch. She goes, "You know what? You should just contact the owner of this apartment and just talk to him, see if you could get a lower rent." It never occurred to me to even think to do that.
That's great.
But we took her advice, and surprisingly, the owner was like, "We really like what you guys are about and what you're doing. You're trying to do ministry with college students here. And yes, I can lower it to this amount," which then made it affordable for us.
Wow.
Yeah, I can think of quite a few times where some wisdom my dad gave me came to our benefit. He always told me if I'm getting any work done on anything to always get at least 3 quotes. And that has been really
like bids,
wise advice.
And I'm thinking about advice I learned from a friend. She was a mom just ahead of me in life. Her kids were maybe 5 years older than my kids. And when we were over at their house one time, I think for a holiday, some kid broke something. And her response stuck with me forever. And she said, "Oh, don't worry, honey. People are more important than things." And it was hard at times, but it really was true.
That's good.
It's very proverbial as well.
Yeah, it is. Nice little pithy statement. Yeah, I also had an apartment hunting situation on the other coast. We moved to New York and were looking for an apartment, and we had gotten rejected from the first one we applied. And I thought it was just because of our income or something like that. We ended up getting approved for the second place that we looked at. And I really didn't like it. Like, I didn't like the location. I didn't like the layout. But I felt like I was afraid because we had to move out of the previous place in a few weeks of just being stuck. But after a day or two, I had buyer's remorse. And so I called out to someone who was mentoring me at the time. And I just kind of shared, like, I don't know what to do. Like, I think I just made a really bad decision about this apartment. And he was like, "Well, what if you just ask them to give you the money, the deposit that you already gave them back?" I'm like, I'm in Brooklyn. Like, people don't just give money back. You know what I mean? And he said, "What's the worst thing they could say?" And I was like, no. So I called. And he said, "Sure, we'll do that. We'll hold off until you see if you get this other place."
Wow.
And I got the other place. They gave me the money back. And I've been living there ever since.
So cool.
Yeah. And so, the thing about those stories that are interesting is that as we've been going through Proverbs, one issue that keeps coming up throughout the book is wise counsel. In our last conversation, we talked about folly and wisdom and how can you know the difference? Well, one key component to the answer to that question that Proverbs offers us is wise counsel. So let's look at a couple passages that we could just kind of maybe just go around and start. Daniel, if you could take Proverbs 11:14, Vivian, Proverbs 24:6, and then Elisa, if you could take Proverbs 15:22, and I'll get the last one.
Proverbs 11:14, where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors there is safety.
Proverbs 24:6, for by wise guidance you can wage your war, and in abundance of counselors there is victory.
Proverbs 15:22, without counsel plans fail, but with many advisors they succeed.
Proverbs 12:15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. So what stands out to you here when you read these passages?
Yeah, you're going to be a lot smarter with a lot of people, wise people inputting you.
Yeah, and the phrase abundance of counselors. So the idea that not just asking one person, but having a few people you can lean on.
Getting 3 bids.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. There
I mean,
you go.
and when you think about it, like, and again, just because we're talking about principles, not promises, because there is such a thing as bad counsel too.
Sure.
We were talking about Solomon and his boys. Well, one of them, people will go up to him after Solomon dies and he's like, "Hey," the elders come up to him and says, "Look, there were a lot of building projects, a lot of heavy taxes on us. If you just, kind of gave us a little bit of reprieve, we will all serve and support you. And then he goes to his
the
young
young
boys,
guys,
the young guys. And it makes it very clear, And they said, no. You got to flex your muscle. You got to show you're strong. You're not weak. And he listens to the younger guys, and it actually splits the kingdom.
Yes.
So there is this aspect that counsel matters. And it's funny because even in our culture, I think of different environments where we don't even do things without that sense of counsel, like a war room. Like we know that phrase war room, that exists. And there's Secretary of Defense, there's Secretary of State, there's the president, there's people who are gathered to try to figure out what is the best thing to do, because we, even in our government, have a system of checks and balances. How else do you see this aspect of counsel just kind of show up in our lives?
Yeah, for me, it was during the process of going through ordination in the Anglican Church. It's a discernment process, meaning that it begins with a group of people from the church that all meet with you for a good 6 months or more.
Wow.
And ask questions and pray together and things like that. And then you don't move forward in the process if that group says not yet or no or something like that. So that was a big part for me. And
that's a great example. I think in churches in general, if you have a board of elders or you have a board of deacons or whatever, but I also think about nonprofits and for-profits. Both have boards which create accountability and offer advice. Yeah.
What I think caught my attention with your example is with this abundance of counselors, I think our generation doesn't appreciate often the wisdom of those who are older. And we miss out on the intergenerational part. At our church, we have a really robust senior citizen ministry, and they are some of my favorites because they are the saints that have walked with Jesus through the good and the hard, and they have so much to offer.
I've also heard of, like, in some groups where they're trying to figure out safety or trying to do a rescue or something like that. Really healthy groups will have someone where their whole job is to be the naysayer or the one that points out the holes. And so one of the things that we tend to be really uncomfortable with is when people give pushback and advice.
Right.
But really wise counsel has someone who's going to be the person who's going to push back and make sure that we're really getting to the best kind of solution too.
Absolutely. And one of the things that is required, absolutely essential for wise counsel, is listening. And it can sometimes be a challenge, because this is why we build up to this, right? Because if I have pride, then I might think I know the right way. If I look at folly and I want to just take an easy shortcut, I might be tempted to not listen. But this aspect of listening to others, and that can sharpen and challenge you, I think is so important. And we see this even in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul writes, and starting with verse 14, "For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body." And he goes on to explain that God has put us in a body and that we need each other. And sometimes there are elements that I don't see that somebody else can see. And that's what the Proverbs is revealing in this aspect of counsel. What are some things that have made it maybe easier for you to receive counsel, or that have encouraged you in this aspect of listening to others?
I think by sometimes being with people who don't listen. Right? Like the anti-mentor, we all can think of those people in our lives that are the people that don't listen, right? And that's usually what we come away from frustrated in the conversation, because it's like, no, they weren't listening.
Yeah. I think I've learned how much people appreciate being asked for wisdom. We can tend to go, well, I look stupid if I ask for wisdom. The reality is I'm honoring somebody else and benefiting.
One of my favorite Proverbs is Proverbs 20, verse 5. It says, "The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out.
Ooh,
Yeah.
that's a good one.
And that picture reveals this aspect that there's sometimes things inside of us that we don't have the ability to even understand what's going on inside of us. And that's why even therapy and counseling can be really helpful, and really good counselors can do that for us. God designed us to be in community and to receive counselors. And when we do that, then we are walking in wisdom.
Yeah, a big part of wisdom is looking for and listening to wise counsel. Going solo, that may be our preference. And we may think that doing things all on our own has virtue, but proverbial wisdom tells us that there is tremendous value and security and wisdom in getting the perspective and advice of others. Now, of course, as they said, there is such a thing as bad advice, but wisdom also has a discernment aspect to it as well, doesn't it? Well, in just a moment, we're going to wrap up our time together by exploring how the wisdom of the book of Proverbs connects us to Jesus. And so how does the wisdom and skill for handling life found in this proverbial wisdom point to Christ? Well, Rasul will help us make the connection right after we take a moment to preview where we'll be going in our next study together. Next time on the Discover the Word podcast, Daniel slides over into the leader's chair. He's prepared a series of conversations on the subject of prayer that he's calling Praying with God. And we're going to explore some questions that we have about prayer, because to be honest, we all have some. Like, why do people, even non-religious people, feel the need to pray?
We did some research specifically for the ministry effort I lead for our Daily Bread Ministries, which is Reclaim Today, focused on younger folks, so 18 to 36. 60% said they pray daily. Another 25% say they pray weekly. So about 85% of people pray pretty regularly. And it's interesting, even people that are not affiliated with a religion, 20% of them pray because they need help, which was interesting.
Yeah, so a lot of us do pray, but why? And what is prayer, really? Well, those and a lot more questions form the foundation for our study, Praying with God, next time. Now, here on Discover the Word, we invite you to be part of these conversations that invite you to be part of the group as we explore topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus, the living Word of God, in the pages of the written Word. And so in this episode, Rasul and Elisa and Daniel and Vivian have been in the book of Proverbs, looking at this practical wisdom for living life skillfully. Wisdom that begins with what is called the fear of the Lord. And so to wrap this up, Rasul wants us to focus on that important piece of what I just said we try to accomplish with these conversations, and that is discover how Proverbs connects us to Jesus. So let's listen to how the group concludes this study called Proverbial Wisdom.
Okay, so we've been discussing the wisdom of Proverbs in the last few conversations. You know, what stood out to you so far?
Well, we've got to say it every single time that Proverbs are not promises. You've been saying they're principles, you know, that they're just like ideas to consider, but they're not like, if you do, then you will.
Absolutely.
Formulas.
Yeah. In fact, if it is wisdom, wisdom knows that things don't always work out the way we expect,
that's
right?
true.
That's part of the life experience that comes with wisdom.
Totally.
I think I've been struck with just the posture of the recipient to be humble. And that's been challenging, but helpful.
Yeah.
I think, too, the dynamic of wisdom thinking about God being in control, trying to do things God's way, following God to the best of our ability, those types of things, being contrasted with folly or pride or arrogance or haughtiness that is trying to do it my own way, as if I'm the center of the story and I know what's best.
And to be fair, we're not always clear. Most of our hearts are inclined toward wisdom, but we still trip up in folly. We're not as clear and, I guess, pure as we wish. And we can all get caught up in folly.
Yeah.
Which is why I think the wise counsel is so key, because having other voices to speak into our lives, it helps us realign, really.
Right.
Yeah, otherwise we'll never see our own blind spots.
Right.
Yeah, and the fact that both wisdom and folly are in competition for our hearts and minds. And there are different scenarios, whether it's debt and instant gratification. Oh, you can just put that on a card and take care of it later. Or something else that can become a vice that tells us instant gratification matters more than long term.
Right.
So all of those things happen. Well, as we wrap this up, I want to look at how wisdom relates explicitly to Christ. And there's a passage that we want to look at. It's a longer passage than we've been dealing with in Proverbs 8 from verse 10 to 31. So it's about 21 verses. I'd like for us to just kind of go around and read this passage of wisdom personified, and then we'll explore how that relates to Christ. So Daniel, could you start us off?
Take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil, pride and arrogance, and the way of evil, and perverted speech I hate.
I have counsel and sound wisdom. I have insight. I have strength. By me kings reign, and rulers decree what is just. By me princes rule, and nobles, all who govern justly. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently find me.
Riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, even fine gold, and my yield than choice silver. I walk in the way of righteousness, in the paths of justice, granting an inheritance to those who love me and filling their treasuries.
The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there was no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the children of men. So we read this, right? According to this passage, what role did wisdom have to play in the world?
I just go to John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It is so echoey of God's creation, of Jesus's presence, his beginning, middle, and end, Alpha and Omega reality.
Yeah, and it almost paints a picture of wisdom being intrinsic in creation and in the process of creation.
Which is why you can't say it's just practical and not spiritual. Because this is showing that God essentially formed the world through and in wisdom. And so, which is why that ancient insight that if God made the world, then he has something to say about how we should live in it.
Right.
Makes sense. And also why sometimes we could see people who, or oftentimes that don't explicitly acknowledge God, but have a good work ethic, treat people well, because these are just principles about how the world works and that are spelled out here that still work regardless of who the person may attribute to that success.
Yeah.
This also sounds a lot like another wisdom book, which is Job. And when Job finally gets to the point of just like, all right, God, you're letting me down. Where are you? Why aren't you helping me? And God shows up and answers him. He answers very similarly about, I laid the foundations of the earth. Where were you when I shut up the sea behind doors and made a limit for it and said, this far you may come and no further? And then here you have the same language. of the sea only going so far and
Limit.
of the world being pulled together and stuff like that. So it's like there's something deeply intrinsic about wisdom, about God being in control and being the creator, of trying to your point, Rasul, live in step with the way God has orchestrated the world to operate and how it should go.
So then there's this really interesting, I want to pull in this thread that Elisa shared earlier about John 1 and how you see the echoes that Jesus, was with God in the beginning, because Colossians 1:15 through 19 spells this out even more. Starting from verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Does that sound familiar?
It does. It really
It does, that echo.
But there's something different about Proverbs 8 and its personification of wisdom in Colossians, or, what do you see there are some differences there?
Well, in Proverbs 8, it definitely sounds like wisdom is present,
Right.
but isn't necessarily the one making it happen, right? So I come forth first, and then while God, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he established the fountains of the deep. So it's like this idea that he's with God in some way, but the way Colossians paints the picture, the way John paints the picture, is the word is the thing that's also doing the creating. The wisdom is doing the creating.
Sometimes these languages like make the persons of the Trinity interchangeable almost. But in reading this the way you're leading us right now, I'm starting to sense wisdom being more the Holy Spirit. We always forget about the Holy Spirit. I do, especially in the Old Testament. But in this passage, I'm thinking about the Holy Spirit that really does provide wisdom to our hearts and guide us. And this is just really rich.
And I think this is where genre is helpful to remember that Proverbs is an anthology of poetic wisdom literature. And it's also interesting to see that the personification in wisdom in Proverbs is a woman.
Yeah.
And I think it's significant because it reveals a certain recognition of the reflection of wisdom and wisdom that is sometimes lacking in our culture. And yet there's still importance to remember that principle of not concretizing everything that is so literal, right? So the fact that you read and it's talking about an adulterous woman, well, you got to remember that could just as easily be talking about an adulterer, right? Like, or a son, my son do this, could just as easily apply to a daughter. And so that kind of fluidity is important to remember and to keep in mind, so that when we see in the New Testament that this personification of wisdom is in Christ, then it's not in competition at all with Proverbs. It's actually just kind of bringing it to bear in a clearer way. And I just think there's something so comforting and meaningful about the fact that Jesus isn't just a savior. He isn't just righteous, but he's wise. And he was wisdom in the beginning, because that means I can trust him with every area of my life. You want to see some wisdom? Read the Sermon on the Mount, talking about anger, talking about lust, talking about forgiveness, generosity, and prayer. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that beginning of wisdom starts with Jesus, the image of God and the embodiment of wisdom on earth. And it continues with humility and wise counsel. And when we trust in him and his ways and lean not to our own understanding, we live a life of skill and beauty and flourishing in this life and the life to come.
And there you have a great week of conversations on the proverbial wisdom of the book of Proverbs and the skillful way of living life it promotes, and how even this collection of wisdom points to Jesus. Thanks, Rasul. Rasul Berry leading the study with Elisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, and Vivian Babuni. And thank you for being here at the table with us. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And here at Discover the Word and Our Daily Bread Ministries, it is our mission to make the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to people all around the world. Our goal is to fuel a global Bible engagement movement. And as a donor-funded nonprofit organization, it is the generous support of listeners like you that makes it possible for us to tell the story of Jesus in 58 languages, in more than 150 countries around the world, with a wide variety of resources. So would you consider partnering with us financially with a one-time donation or by becoming a monthly partner? Just go to discovertheword.org and look for the donate button that's up at the top of the page. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Hettinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.